Welcome to Criminology's first podcast. Today we are talking about campaigns, why they started, the crime or issue that caused them, and how it all came about. So we're going to go over to our first campaign.
Clare's Law campaign was founded by her father. It was created to change laws and allow people who are concerned about a partner's behaviour to find out if their partner has ever been charged or imprisoned for domestic abuse. Clare was murdered by her ex-boyfriend in 2009, who had a history of violence against previous women. Clare's body was found by her ex-husband, who had been asked by her father to go checking at her house as Clare wasn't answering the phone. She was strangled and set on fire. The target audience for this campaign was the Parliament. This campaign was a success as Clare's Law enabled the domestic violence disclosure scheme to start in July 2012 and introduced new powers to protect victims. This used petitions to help achieve their aims and used advertising. They partnered up with a fabulous magazine. They undertook a poll about whether people would leave a relationship if they were told their partner is a serial domestic abuser. This helped the Clare's Law campaign significantly as it helped them change the laws around people knowing whether their partners are domestic abusers.
Sara's Law started when Sara Penn, an 8-year-old girl, was abducted and murdered by a known paedophile, Roy Whiting. On the evening of July 1st, 2000, Sara was playing hide-and-seek with her two brothers and a younger sister in a cornfield near the grandparents' home in West Sussex. During the game, Sara ran off the edge of the field and onto the road. Waiting there was a sexual predator, Roy Whiting, who abducted her in a white van. In 1955, Roy Whiting was jailed and put on the sex offenders register after abducting and incidentally assaulting a 9-year-old girl. As a result, he was known by the police and was first spoken to by officers just 24 hours after Sara's disappearance. Whiting told police he knew nothing of Sara's disappearance. On July 17, Sara's body was found in the undergrowth in a field near Pullsborough, 15 miles from where she had gone missing, but, crucially, only 3 miles from where Whiting had bought fuel that the police found at his house. 3 days later, one of Sara's shoes was found in the village of Coolham, 4 miles from where her body was left. On Sunday, July 23rd, Whiting stole a Vauxhall Nova and became involved in a high-speed chase with the police. After crashing into a parked car, Whiting was arrested, charged and bailed. On Monday, July 31st, Whiting is again arrested, but this time in connection with Sara's murder. Again, he is released without charge. That week, Sara's funeral takes place at St. Peter's Church in Hersham. On September 26th, Whiting is sentenced to 22 months in jail at Chichester Crown Court after admitting 1 count of dangerous driving and 1 count of taking a vehicle without consent. Meanwhile, the police continued to search for the white van, and it's here that they found the evidence that they were looking for. A single blonde hair was found on the t-shirt in the van. A DNA proved it is highly likely it was Sara's. In February 2001, while in prison for the driving offence, Whiting was formally charged with the murder of Sara Penn. Whiting appeared at Lewes Crown Court on February 6, 2001, where he pleaded not guilty to murder. His trial began on November 14, 2001 and lasted 4 weeks. He was found guilty and sentenced to life in prison. It was after his conviction that the truth of his past sexual offences became public, which angered the Penn family and wider public. This is what caused Sara's mother to start the campaign for Sara's Law. Sara's Law was set up in order to introduce and enforce the child sex offenders disclosure scheme. While we would allow the parents to check if there were any known sex offenders living in the area in order to keep their children safe. Sara Penn, Sara's mother, campaigned for 8 to 10 years for the introduction of child sex offenders disclosure scheme. It was piloted in 4 police areas originally in 2008 and then it rolled out nationally in 2010 by the Home Office. Sara's Law was successful. As a result of this, the Child Sex Offenders Disclosure Scheme was enforced, which allows parents, carers and guardians to ask the police to tell them if someone has a criminal record for child sexual offences if they believe they are a threat to their children. If police checks show that the individual has a record for child sexual offences or other offences that might put a child at risk, the police will consider sharing this information. The police will only consider telling the person best placed to protect the child, usually a parent, carer or guardian. If the person being checked has a record of child sexual offences or other offences that indicate they may pose a risk to the child, the police will disclose information only if it is lawful, necessary, proportionate to do so in the interest of protecting the child or children from harm.
So the methods that were used were Sara's mother, Sara, linked up with the News of the World, and the News of the World supported her campaign. They released the names and the pictures of 50 known paedophiles in the area, which was hugely controversial at the time. This sparked public outrage, which led to huge petitions and marches, and as a result of that, Sara Penn was able to get an audience with MPs and lobby Parliament through letters and personal discussions one-to-one with MPs to really push the reason why this disclosure scheme was so important.
The Anne Ming campaign was started to change the law of double jeopardy when Anne's daughter Julie Hogg was murdered by William Dunlop. He was acquitted, and then after he was acquitted he confessed to murdering her. But because of the double jeopardy law, they couldn't take him back to court to convict him. The campaign was targeted at Parliament and judges to influence and change the law, and the public and parents in particular. They use lobbying as a campaign method, and she wrote letters to Parliament to try and change the law on double jeopardy, and she also wrote a book. The campaign had been running for 17 years, and at the end of it, the double jeopardy law was abolished in Criminal Justice Act in 2003. And after this, they could also prosecute Stephen Lawrence's killers.
Why did the campaign start? Why did FACS start?
Okay, FACS started in 2007, but it grew out of a group called Bereaved by Work in the Northwest, which I had set up in the 1980s, late 80s, early 90s. And it started because I was working on health and safety, and I was more and more coming across families of people who had been killed through the negligence of their employers. And the injustices that they faced in terms of trying to get the law enforced, trying to get proper charges brought against the negligent employers, trying to get support for finding out exactly what had happened through inquests, and trying to get adequate compensation, civil compensation from the negligent employers and through the benefits system were all extremely difficult. And none of these families were supported by the state organisations like Victim Support, which is funded through the Home Office. They weren't considered, although we did consider them, they weren't considered to be victims of crime, except where there was suspected corporate manslaughter, which at the time those cases were very rare because the new law hadn't come into place. So we were set up because there was a great need from families of people who've been killed at work for support in understanding the whole process and trying to get some justice out of it.
Right, okay, thanks. So what were the main aims were the justice then? You've already spoken about that.
The aims were sort of multiple. They were to support families because there's very little support or understanding of people who've lost someone in a work-related incident. It's thought to be very rare. People have an idea that that health and safety in the UK is so fantastic, and employers are under such tight restrictions that it doesn't happen very often. So most people don't really sort of understand it. And there's also a fairly heavy sort of idea that if people do get killed at work, then probably they were a bit careless or a bit stupid. So there's not a lot of sympathy, not a lot of support for those people. But also, there's just what we wanted to do is also to make sure that other people weren't killed in the same way, because what was obvious was that these weren't accidents. They didn't just happen. They were almost always entirely foreseeable and could have been and should have been prevented. And so we wanted also to make sure that they were prevented. We wanted to campaign for better health and safety. We wanted to make sure, though, that the people who committed these crimes were actually properly punished, which would have a deterrent effect. So there was a range of aims of the campaign: to get justice for the families, to make sure that deaths at work were treated equally to deaths in other sort of circumstances, that there were strict and appropriate penalties applied to employers, which would mean then there would be a greater deterrent effect. And we wanted to make people aware that death at work is not an accident. It is due to negligence. It is a crime. Some people will call it work murder. And we wanted to make sure that we used all of that, the voice, give families a voice, and to campaign for better laws, stricter enforcement, higher penalties, and so on.
Okay, all right, thank you. What methods do you use to campaign?
Whatever's most appropriate and whatever we can at the time. We have an almost negligible budget, so we don't use things specifically use advertising and things like that. We would use events. We would use issues around a particular case. So when there was an inquest, when there was a trial, we'd make sure that we would organise press coverage, television, radio, and try and ensure that the families had a voice. We would make sure we put out press releases. We would make sure we would keep it very much in the public eye and make sure that the person's story came out to carry that message. Increasingly now, we use social media, and we use events. We organise, meetings around work-related deaths, specific issues, specific cases, specific incidents. We also use International Workers' Memorial Day on the 28th of April every year, which was brought to this country in the early 90s by the Houses Campaign, and we use that very much all over the country as an opportunity to make sure that we publicise individual cases. At our event in Manchester, we read out the names of the people who've been killed, and we use posters, we use exhibitions in the People's History Museum, or whatever is the most appropriate. We have been involved with documentaries like, Inside Out or Dispatches or Panorama, which might give information and advice to all those sort of, when they're doing something that's at all relevant to the campaign.
Right, how do you find out about that to access things like Panorama?
Through our work with the Houses Campaign, we have a press list of people we work with, and so those people would come to us usually when they're carrying out some sort of investigation and see if we had any contacts with people. Journalists frequently require help to get detailed contact with families who've been involved in any sort of incident. Quite often these families are reluctant, and they need a sort of a sort of go-between, or an advocate or whatever. And so we would often play that role, put them in contact. They might ring us up and say, they're looking for people who've been affected by a particular sort of death, and then we try and see if we could find people who were prepared to speak on that.
Okay, all right, great, thanks. Which are the most successful methods of campaigning so far for you?
I think that's quite a difficult thing to say. I think Workers' Memorial Day has been very successful at getting the information out within, say, the trade union movement and to certain sectors of the press. Social media is increasingly being useful. We also produced a video in about 2009, I think, called Face the Facts, where we told as many stories as we possibly could in a short time, and we sold our video. We sold about 2,000 copies of our video, and that is still being shown all around the country. People going out and speaking at conferences. We try to support and empower families. Not all families can do this, not all families want to do this. And quite often there's someone in a family who does want to talk about the death of their husband or their son or their brother or their loved one or whatever. And we would make sure that we provide those speakers for Workers' Memorial Day events across the country and for trade union conferences or for health and safety conferences, and try and support them in trying to do that as well as they could. And one of our founder FAC members, Louise Taggart, last year I think she spoke at 114 events across the country, and she has her own Twitter hashtag and a website called Michael's Story, where she tells the story of her brother Michael Adamson, who was electrocuted in Aberdeen through the gross negligence of his employer Mighty some years ago. And she tells that story all across the country at conferences and to companies that work in the electrical field. It's quite often she'll go into a workplace and she'll speak to everybody. She'll go into a dockyard and just to speak to everybody from representatives of the Ministry of Defence, admirals, right down to the newest apprentices.
Okay, all right. Do you think that's one of the successes that you have had as a group? You know, what have your successes been?
Oh, well, what have our successes been? I think one of the most important things we've done is to publicise the fact that work-related death is a huge problem. The Hazards Campaign has for some years produced estimates of the number of people who are killed at work, because nobody else does that. The HSE doesn't produce the full figures because it doesn't collect and count them and report them. And so we estimate the real numbers of deaths. The HSE will say last year 144 people were killed in incidents at work. Well, we know that's not right, because they're not counting the deaths on the roads and in the air and at sea, or suicides, or members of the public. So we count all of those up, and we also count up the estimates from experts of the numbers of people who are killed by cancer, heart disease, lung disease, neurological diseases caused by work, and we publicise them, and that's about 50,000 a year. So we publicise all of those sort of things, and that has actually been quite successful. We've got gaining traction within the health and safety press, within the national press to some extent, although they're still very reluctant to take this. So the real figures about what's going on at work aren't out there, aren't known, and so the real hazards to workers, what they really face, also aren't known. And that is being quite successful. The work we've done has just resulted in Canada, in some researchers in Canada, Steve Bittle and colleagues producing a report on the underestimation of work-related deaths in Canada, and they've used some of our methods to do that. Our colleagues in Asia and other places have done similar calculations there. So we know that the official figures from the International Labour Organization of 2.78 million workers killed by work every year are grossly underestimated. And it's important to make that clear to people, because if we can say, if we can make it clear that work-related death is a huge issue, we can demand more resources and more policy and more action to prevent that.
Yeah, okay. All right, thank you. We're going to have to finish around now, but thank you for all that information. If you could just, I'll say thank you to Hilda Panorama from FAC, and I know that you were really pivotal in getting the group together. That's right, isn't it, Hilda, that you
Yes.
got everybody together and have kept them together. So Stan, could you just tell everybody what FAC stands for, please, and why you chose that acronym as well?
Okay, FAC is Families Against Corporate Killers, and we chose that acronym. I had previously called the group in the Northwest Bereaved by Work in the Northwest, because I thought it explained what it was, and also because we have to be quite sensitive to what people want and not make it too in your face. FAC is actually the acronym that was coined by Dorothy Wright, whose son Mark Wright was killed in a horrific recycling incident in Deeside, and she coined that because she wanted it to be very in your face, because that is how families think about it. It is corporate killing. They think of it as a form of murder, and they wanted it to be Families Against Corporate Killers.
Lovely. Thank you for explaining that, and thank you for speaking to me. I know how busy you are, so I really appreciate it.
So this podcast will be useful for any students that have Unit 1, Task 2 coming up. You need to be able to compare and contrast a minimum of 8 different campaigns, discussing why they started, what the aim of the campaign was, the methods that they used, if there was any merchandise available, how long the campaign ran for or has been running for, and ultimately if they were successful in their aim. Hopefully this will give you an insight into 4 campaigns, three of which we have looked at in class, one of which is new, which is our FAC campaign that we've just spoken to then. You need to be able to include your own campaign in your comparison, so make sure you fully flesh out what your campaign is going to be, because that's how you will get maximum marks.